Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report, where we take a look at current and historical events from an original intent standpoint with the hopes of understanding and returning to our true Federalist roots. Joining me today is my good friend, Ron Partain, the host of the Untold History channel, and also my good friend, constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Hello,
Gentlemen, how are you? Gentlemen, how are you?
Fantastic.
Doing very well. It's a beautiful, crisp, pre-spring morning in Southern California.
Don't even talk about weather to me. I have been shoveling ice and snow every morning, uphill, barefoot, in the snow, carrying my...
No, it's cold here right now. It's 45 degrees.
Stop it. Just stop.
Yeah, it's probably like minus 45 for him.
Welcome to another episode of the Weather Report and why I'm an idiot for living where I am. All right, on to our topic for today.
Well, hey, you know what? There's a price to be paid for having that weather, and that price is access to the library that you have access to. So I don't know, that's actually a pretty decent trade-off.
Yeah, there are some perks. What he's referring to me as my soon-to-be father-in-law has got an amazing library of historical, constitutional, Revolutionary War era books, and I get to go browse there just about any time I want.
Yeah,
and,
you've mentioned that to me too, along with all of the artifacts that are lying around.
Yeah, it'll be fun to show it off someday. Today's topic, we are going to dive into, well, it's the second episode of our dive into the Confederate Constitution. Last week we did first one where we talked about really the background of the different constitutional documents, whether it be the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution of the United States, or the most recent iteration of a founding document in America, which is the Confederate Constitution. And the reason we did that is not to relitigate the Civil War, the causes, or anything like that. Although that is going to come up, it's part of the conversation, because as you go through this Confederate Constitution, and notice the difference. Yeah, when you look at the differences between this document and the Constitution of the United States, you're going to understand. You're going to get inside the heads of the people who wrote the Confederate Constitution, and it's going to give you I guess, a really good insight into what they were thinking and why they decided to secede. So,
if I may. What you've got is you have to look inside the heads of the men who wrote the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, and the Articles of Confederation were done kind of as a mechanism to form a government while they were at war, and then when they won the war, then they came back and then did the Constitution. And the Articles of Confederation, who knows if that form of government would have stood, but that was their attempt to take what they thought was the good parts of both and meld them together. In my opinion, that was
historically, confederations never hold together.
Right.
You've got to have a stronger centralization of government, and it's funny because when it comes to the distribution of powers in government, it's really a kind of a very careful dance. It's almost like when you're seasoning your food. Too little is not good enough. Too much is too much. And you're trying to find that balance. And when it comes to the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, that's what they thought that they were finding. That the Articles of Confederation was not enough. The Constitution was too much, and so they were kind of tinkering to try to find that balance. But because they moved too much towards Confederation, it created its issues. So when you have and it's interesting because you want sovereignty, you want independence, you want autonomy among the units that are in a union, but at the same time, there's got to be enough of a cohesiveness, and enough of the central power for the federal government to take care of certain things, and without state interference. So it's just a very careful dance. But under the Articles of Confederation, eventually the United States would have been invaded, taken over by different European powers, in my opinion, which is what a lot of the thinking was at the time. And that's just my humble opinion.
It was the I think it was Georgia who threatened to secede from the Confederacy midway through the war because he saw that Jefferson Davis had said, "Hey, look, I need some of the powers that Lincoln has to prosecute this war." And the Confederate States were like, "No, we're not going to give that to you because that's the whole reason we're fighting this war is because we don't want that." And basically, the decentralized nature of the Confederate Constitution ultimately led to the ruin of the Confederacy.
Absolutely.
That's a point I made last week, and I'm glad you followed up on that because it's really important. What Lincoln did almost immediately was nationalize the government. He became basically a dictator in chief. Suspended all kinds of parts about the Constitution. Was able to print money, the greenback, and when you nationalize something, a government, you're going to have more power than a decentralized version of it. And that's one of the main reasons the North was able to win. It wasn't just about population and a more powerful economy. So,
and centralized power like that is a very efficient government. Things get done quickly.
Yes, but at what cost?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So before we jump in, speaking of books, there's a book here called The Confederate Constitution of 1861, written by
Marshall. I have that book.
So Marshall DeRosa. He does a lot of writing.
You need to start telling me the books that you're going to show in advance so that I can so that I can say, look, I have it too.
That way he doesn't feel like
I don't feel left out
into the romper room.
I want to share too. I'm just totally teasing.
I'm reading the opening paragraph. It's by Marshall DeRosa, who does a lot of writing at the Abbeville Institute, which we all like. And this opening paragraph tells an awful lot. It's just the introduction. I'm going to read one paragraph from it. It says, "The Confederate States of America, politically established in 1861 and militarily extirpated in 1865, was neither simply a historic accident initiated by radicals attempting to prolong the life of an anachronism system of labor, slavery, nor the product of, quote, fire-eating political opportunists seeking personal aggrandizement at the expense of their fellow citizens. These factors had an impact, but in the final analysis of the Confederate States of America was the consequence of a constitutional crisis, the origins of which could be traced back to the U.S. Constitution of 1789. It was not a crisis for constitutional government per se, but the consequence of an incrementally changing constitutional arrangement increasingly unacceptable to the Southern section of the Union. The Southerners did not abandon constitutional government. To the contrary, they reaffirmed their commitment to constitutional government under the auspices of the Confederate Constitution." I think that's very well said. Mm-hmm. And what they're basically saying is the South seceded because the North was trying to impose a different form of government than the Southern states had originally agreed to.
Correct. And it's funny too because, and we've seen this in news recently. One of the blames of the war between the states is nullification, and the thought that is put out there is that the Southern states were nullifying, and therefore it was a problem. And the nullification is bad. The Southern states weren't nullifying; the Northern states were, and the Southern states didn't like it. And the Northern states were nullifying perfectly constitutional law. And when you hear someone say, "Well, Madison, spoke out against nullification," no, he spoke out against nullification when it's not the nullification of constitutional or unconstitutional, should I say, law. What was happening in the North, for example, is the Fugitive Slave Act, which was supported by Article 4 of the Constitution, was being ignored by the Northern states, and they were not sending slaves back to the South if they escaped to the North. And the federal government wasn't enforcing that constitutional crisis. The Northern states were nullifying, the federal government was doing nothing about it, and the Southern states, felt, among other things, because those things were piling up, that writing was on the wall that the Northern states and the federal government wasn't willing to follow the Constitution, And so they were going to follow their constitutional authorities of being able to secede because it was a voluntary union.
Right.
Well, let's jump into this Confederate Constitution. We've taken quite a bit of time getting up to, but it's about time to jump in.
Let's do it.
Okay, we are going to start with the preamble. One of the things that's going to be interesting is I have the U.S. Constitution pulled up right next to it. We can refer to it if we want to. We don't have to because Doug's got the whole darn thing memorized word for word, and Ron's not too far behind there. But we want to really point out the differences between the two documents because therein lies the real, the whole purpose of what we're doing is to point out the similarities and the differences. So, jumping in here, we're going to use the version we have on the Avalon Project, which is a wonderful website for historical documents. That looked big enough.
I warned you. I warned you when I introduced you to the Avalon Project. It is addicting.
It is. And I've read almost probably 5% of what's in there.
I just don't look that it's Yale.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, I know. Even Yale does something right every once in a while.
Well, as they say, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Yeah. So,
Ron's the font big enough?
Little small.
Okay, I'll zoom one more. Okay, we are going to start with a preamble, and it's going to sound very similar, but different. It says, "We, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character, in order to form a permanent federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the Confederate States of America." Now I'm going to go back and let's just break down each part of this. It starts with "we, the people of the Confederate States," as opposed to
punctuation changed.
Yes, and
"we,
course,
comma, the people of the Confederate States."
Why does that matter?
And it was just updating the changing, but it is the punctuation is different. What does matter is something that I'll point out later on when it comes to something similar. But continue, please.
Well, I'd like to say something about this, and maybe you're going to say the same thing, Doug. And if you are, I apologize for stepping on your toes. But initially, the preamble was going to say "we, the states." We the people of the United States of America, or something along those lines, but then they ultimately just shortened it to "we the people."
It still says "we the people of the United States of America."
I would have actually preferred.
Or no, I'm sorry. It was going to say "we the states." "We the states," I believe, is what they were going to ultimately say.
Yeah, we've talked about that, Ron. That's it's actually a really good point because had they said "we the states," it would shoot down a lot of these theories that we're a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it's important because who ratified the Constitution? Was it the people?
Mm-hmm.
No, it was the states.
Thank you.
And the idea of "we the people" was trying to put forth a image of unity, and we're not talking unity of the way it's put out by some of today's politicians, where you compromise in order to be a part of the group, be more inclusive. But we the people, we the people are presenting this together, the understanding that this is going to be it with the same goal. That kind of unity, and that's really what it was about. But of the Confederate States, and they left off of America just like the preamble of the United States Constitution.
It was, in the documentary, in the docudrama, I guess is probably a better way to say it, of John Adams. It was really interesting in there. I remember I forgot he was the guy from he in the show he was portrayed from Pennsylvania, but he was actually from Delaware, and he was more like he was the leader of the pacifists guys.
Dickinson,
thank you. Dickinson said only the people can declare independence, and John Adams rightfully said no. The people look to us to lead, and that's why they put us here. And so the in a way it was the people, but it was the people through the vassal of the men that were elected to represent them on their behalf at that convention.
Dickinson was an interesting fellow, and you say Delaware and Pennsylvania, and the reason why there's a little confusion there is he was indeed from Delaware. Matter of fact, I'm looking at, but he was Delaware. He represented Pennsylvania and Delaware, but he was on Pennsylvania's table, but he lived in Delaware at the time. But the reason why is because Delaware actually used to be considered the South counties of Pennsylvania. It's an interesting Delaware actually, and a lot of people don't know this. We always say 13 original colonies, and we say that because those 13 original states. If you were to say 12 original colonies, it would confuse people. Right. But actually, there was only 12 original colonies. Delaware was never a colony. It was the South counties of Pennsylvania, but it declared its statehood in 1776.
It was the first one because
it was the first one to do so. Yeah,
because Delaware's license.
Well, they're also the first to ratify the Constitution too.
Yeah, their license plate says the first state.
Well, it's because they were first to sign the Constitution, but they did declare statehood first also in 1776. But anyway, so Pennsylvania and Delaware has a tight relationship because, like I said, Delaware was considered a part of Pennsylvania for the longest time, and so that's why he was of Delaware. And he was actually, if I remember properly, lived in Delaware, but he was representing Pennsylvania because that was where his ties were or something like that. But anyway, the thing about Dickinson, the reason why he was so opposed to a lot of what was going on is because he was a Quaker. The Quakers were not happy about the violent part of the war.
Yeah, but it was I want to say it was July 6th of 1775. He and was it Thomas Jefferson who penned a letter suggesting why or that an armed insurrection was if they took up arms against the British, why it was justified. Right. I didn't know that about Dickinson. If you only watch John Adams and you see that and you see Dickinson there, he looks like he's a weak, soft individual. But from what I have read about him after the fact, he was an amazing author and world renowned in many respects.
Well, and also as a Quaker, he also surprised everybody because once the Declaration of Independence went into place and George Washington was commander in chief, he took up arms.
Yeah, he went to war.
All right, I'm going to get us back on track because we are 7 words into this Confederate Constitution, and you've already gone down 13 different rabbit trails. So
sorry.
No,
This stuff is it's just
whenever that happens, you ought to have like an image of bunny ears that suddenly appear on the screen or something.
Well, I'm gonna go. I keep meaning to go get one of those little plastic fishing prices. Fishing.
No, what you need to do is you need to get an Elmer Fudd. I'm gonna hunt wabbits, and then just put it right on the screen.
Something. All right. Continuing on, if I may, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character. Now, that's an important little...
It lays out autonomy in language.
Yeah, they don't have that in the preamble to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So they are making it crystal clear that each state is sovereign in and of itself. Why is that important? Because this is a confederation of sovereign states, just like the U.S. Constitution was supposed to be. Mm-hmm. They are re-emphasizing the sovereign nature of each state. In order to form a permanent federal government.
That's language drawn from the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation and of the Perpetual Union. And I'm trying to draw back to that language.
What's interesting is you talk about the sovereign and independent character of the states, and then in the next sentence, you talk about the permanent federal government. Well, the federal government is permanent because it does not imply that the states are not free to come and go. Exactly. The federal government, when the southern states seceded from the Union, they didn't say we were going to overthrow, Washington, D.C. They're saying, no, we're going to go our own merry way. This implies that that's still okay.
Well, and to that point, that is why the term Civil War is not an accurate representation of what happened, because the Civil War is two entities fighting for control of
Right.
one thing, and the South was not fighting for control of DC. They were fighting for control of their own self-determination.
Yeah, you'll never hear me refer to it as Civil War. It's always war between the states.
Or Northern Aggression.
There's a number of good titles that are better than Civil War. Continuing, we're going to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Stop right there. Yep.
I know you want to get into invoking, which is different. That language is not only exactly as it is in the Constitution, but it's also not. The capitalization of certain words is not there. The Founding Fathers capitalized for emphasis. By the time you got to the latter part of the 19th century, that practice had gone by the wayside.
Let me just show what Doug's talking about there real quick. Here's the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, and that section right there. Establish justice with a capital J, ensure domestic tranquility with a capital T, provide for the common defense, promote, et cetera, blessings of liberty.
And welfare. Hey, you got welfare. That justifies the welfare state.
And posterity there is capitalized.
Yeah, but notice that the promote general welfare is not in the Confederate Constitution.
Because the general welfare clause had been so abused at that point, they didn't even want general welfare as a part of it.
Well, yeah, it's just too ambiguous and vague. Anything's for the general welfare. Okay, back into the Confederate Constitution. They also did not say here anything about the common defense, which I'm not sure why that was omitted.
Because they wanted the militaries to remain like the militias, where they were guided by the states, which is fascinating to me, because that was the downfall of almost the downfall of the Americans in the Revolution, was, these voluntary, independent, not subject to the central power of the government, which, as you stated earlier, Jefferson Davis going, whoa, there's a mistake. I need more authority over our military. For fear of going one direction, they went too far the other.
Very good. Continuing on, it's an important part. Oh, do you want to mention posterity? What is posterity, Doug?
Well, posterity is future generations. And as I noted a moment ago, it's capitalized in the United States Constitution. And as I like to explain to people, the blessings of liberty, that's natural rights and freedom. So secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Ourselves in the original preamble is not capitalized, posterity is, which is basically saying, yeah, we're doing this for ourselves, but we're especially doing it for future generations.
Right.
Which is fascinating, because that flies in the face of the idea that the Founding Fathers were just a bunch of, rich white guys seeking more power and money for their own pockets. No, in the preamble, they actually say the opposite. We are putting our lives on the line. We're putting our fortunes on the line for and our sacred honor for future generations. Once again, them not capitalizing it does not mean that posterity is not important to these guys, just simply because they no longer capitalize for emphasis.
That is a great point that I had never considered. That was, if I take nothing away today than that statement with what you just made, I'm going to be using that quite frequently now, because I think what you just said was very powerful to me. It's something that I had never considered.
Well, two things. Number one, thank you. And number two, Johnny, apparently you weren't taking notes when you were going through the Constitution class, because I talk about that a lot, but that's okay.
Well, no, again, it's one of those things where, it's timing and when it hits you.
Right.
And
you may not have picked up on it before. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, continuing on. And here's a part that's interesting.
I mean, the part just the part that kills me is when all these freaking Marxists come out and say, "Oh, these rich white people who's slave owners just didn't want to pay taxes," They
tell you the exact opposite right there in the preamble.
Exactly.
Invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God.
Well, and that not only is that reminiscent of the language at the end of the Declaration of Independence, but it's actually a repeat of what the preamble says, which they repeat here: do, ordain, and establish. The reason why it says do, ordain, and establish, the word ordain is in there to mean invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God. Ordain, if you look it up in your dictionaries, new and old, what you realize about that word is it means establish, but it also has a religious connotation with it, to establish, in a religious manner. And so they were not being repetitive when they said ordain and establish. They weren't saying to establish and establish. They were saying to establish in the favor of God and his guidance, and establish. And so the makers of this Constitution, I believe, picked up on that, but they wanted it to be more plainly understood than just saying ordain.
If I may, Doug, this is from 1828 Webster's.
Got it right? I got it on screen.
Yeah.
Properly to set, to establish in a particular office or order, hence to invest with a ministerial function or sacerdotal power, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, to introduce and establish or settle in the pastoral office with the customary forms and solemnities as to ordain a minister of the gospel. In America, men are ordained over a particular church and congregation, or as evangelicists. God, I can't speak today. Yeah. Without the charge of a particular church, or as deacons.
So, and all of the definitions you'll notice are religious in nature, except for number 3.
Right.
To set, to establish, to institute, to constitute. So, and they were really pulling both meanings into it when they put ordain, because once again, they put establish. To ordain and establish. So they didn't mean just to establish and establish. They were adding that religious connotation. And the Confederates said, well, you know what? That's not clear enough. We're going to lay it out in plain language.
My apologies there, Warhamster. I didn't realize I wasn't watching.
He anticipated you, man.
We just, you know what? I guess I could just chalk that up to great minds.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you're married long.
Ouch. What are you trying to say, that I'm married to him?
I want a divorce right now. But what I find fascinating about it, part is they put it in crystal clear: the guidance, under the guidance, favor and guidance of Almighty God. There was no question in their minds that they were founding a Christian nation.
Mm-hmm.
And we hear all this talk about, the founding fathers were atheists or what have you, and just stop that. I mean, I don't want to litigate that right now, but Doug,
right?
You guys both agree with me on this.
Well, God is throughout the United States Constitution.
I'm going to pause my camera because I want to find a book in my collection here. That I want to find something, because it's just a short little passage that I want to read. But continue on. I'll be listening.
So God is throughout the United States Constitution. However, the word God isn't. So that's what's also interesting here, is they include the word God, God, in the Declaration of Independence. The word creator is often used. But throughout the passages, for example, ordain and secure the blessings of liberty, God is throughout the United States Constitution. I was once talking to a pastor about it, and he says, well, the word God, G-O-D, is not in the book of Esther either, but God's throughout the book in the Old Testament, and that's true. But once again, the Confederates feel like a lot of what was in the Constitution was good was not spelled out well enough. It was being taken advantage of. And some of it even needed to be removed, like general welfare. And they wanted to make sure that it was crystal clear, that it was fully understood, that their country, even though ordain implies invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, they want to make sure it was spelled out, that everybody understood, that there was no questions. And once again, they had all these years of looking back and going, this happened, this got forgotten, this was ignored, this was, gamed. Let's put language in there and make sure that doesn't happen to us.
I want to take a step back before, when we finish the preamble, which is pretty short, and we have Ron jumping with stuff, is do ordain and establish this Constitution for the Confederate States of America. Now, who wrote this preamble? And that's the one thing I want to take a step back and talk about. If you look at the top there, it says the Confederate Constitution of the Confederate States, March 11th, 1861. So the quick timeline is Lincoln gets elected in November of 1860. The first states to secede are in order, and I'll give the exact date. South Carolina in December 20th of 1860, Mississippi on January 9th, Florida January 10th, Alabama January 11th, Georgia January 19th, Louisiana January 26th, and Texas February 1st. So these 7 states seceded. Then they meet in was it Mobile, Alabama?
Montgomery,
Alabama. Thank you. And they sat there and looked at the Constitution and said, "Oh, well, this will be easy to write a new Constitution because we'll just take all the parts we like and not the parts we don't, and fix a few things." And it wasn't a major revision. The people that actually wrote it, the main figures were a guy by the name of Christopher Memminger from South Carolina. He's pretty much called the leading drafter. He was a big lawyer and a secessionist. Would end up being the Confederate Secretary of the Treasury. Guy by the name of Howell Cobb from Georgia, and no, gentlemen, there's no relation to him in Ty Cobb. I looked for it. And he was a former U.S. House Speaker and a Georgia governor. There's a few other members. None of these names are going to have really stood out in history, but these were the framers of this document. Of course, again, they had a great cheat sheet to go from.
Yeah, and that's interesting because the Constitution of the United States was written. They wrote this like Jefferson wrote the Declaration, where there was a primary writer and then there were those around him helping. The Constitution wasn't written that way. The Constitution was written in committees. Now, Gouverneur Morris led the committee for the preamble and so on and so forth. And so it's interesting because they were drawing from something, so it needed to be in committee. They had a single writer who was going to draw from things, or in this case, mainly from the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. So how is it that Jefferson did that? Well, he was drawing from things, but his was more original, but he was drawing from the Magna Carta and the Declaration of Rights and other documents. But it also shows the brilliance of Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration, because it was more out of here. It was drawn from things. This was, a guy with other people, more people around him, and influential than as it was with Jefferson. But once again, it's interesting because, like I said, they wrote this out kind of like Jefferson did. It wasn't in committee like the Constitution was.
Yeah, and the first draft goes out in early February of 1861 and gets approved. They had a convention late February to March 11th, 1861. Was ratified quickly by the convention on March 11th and went out to the states for approvals, and they were unanimously approved by April of 1861. Now, by that time, April 1861, Virginia was just coming in after the attack on Fort Sumter. So Virginia actually didn't ratify this. It was deemed. When they joined it, they just accepted it. Just like Alaska joining the United States Constitution. Mm-hmm. Alaska didn't have to ratify it; they just accepted it.
I found this. I'm not going to read the. This is a little book called "Facts the Historians Leave Out," a Confederate primer. It's a very small book. Chapter 5 is were the Southern states brutal, or were the Southern masters brutal to their slaves? Now, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but it says the final paragraph in this section says one thing more. Have you ever wondered how it comes about that nearly every member of the colored race is a Christian? Many of them were uncivilized in their African home, but after living for some years in close contact with their Southern owners, they embraced the Christian faith. Do you think they would have done that and adopted the religion of masters who were brutal to them?
Well, and the Diary of Mary Chestnut Boykin also gives us a window into what life on a plantation was like. And one of the things that jumped out at me reading that was that the most common discipline for the slaves whenever they misbehaved was they couldn't participate in the Friday night dance. I mean,
well, and I was one of the articles that I was reading the other day about this talked about how Stonewall Jackson actually before the war between the states, he actually he taught slaves with their master's permission and freed black people how to read the Bible, or how to read so they could read the Bible for their own salvation. And he got a lot of flack from people in the South who didn't want that to happen, but he didn't care. He's like, I don't care if you like it or not. I'm still going to do it. I mean, so, the whole thing about him being Stonewall, obviously he got that from standing, from standing fast in the face of battle. But he stood fast in the face of many battles, not just the the Battle of Manassas.
Interesting stuff. Now, none of us are we're not making any apologies for slavery whatsoever. I mean, it's
no, not at all.
Practice. The bottom line, the world we lived, the world, 160 years ago was absolutely racist, both in the North and in the South. There's no doubt about it.
It was racist, but slavery wasn't necessarily a racist institution. It was an institution that was bringing cheap slave labor, and the uneducated people that they could use for that were from Africa. I don't know if it was because they're black as much as it was the convenience of a continent full of people that. I don't believe from the South's point of view it was racist because, and 1860 census showed this, is that less than 5% of free whites in the South owned slaves. 27% of free blacks owned slaves. It was basically a cheap labor kind of situation that was on its way out, by the way, because it was becoming cheaper to hire someone than to own somebody.
I am from the South, and I can tell you there's a whole lot of racism.
I'm not saying there isn't white racism. I'm saying that actual institution, while there was racism that developed out of it, the foundation of it, in a sense, wasn't.
I would argue that the heavy racist tendencies that are in the South today really were an outgrowth of the Union occupation and Reconstruction era. It had nothing because if you look at why did they make the black population 3/5 to balance the power? Because 3/5 is more than 1/2. That means that to balance the power, there were more black people in the Confederacy or in the Southern states than there were white. And the white people and the black people literally had to work the land together for survival. And there was, in many respects, they actually grew to where they were. They respected each other, and they looked at each other as human beings. It was the northern attitudes towards blacks when they came down that and they basically destroyed all the infrastructure and killed all the men and the women and essentially turned the blacks into they had to be criminals for survival. And at that point, the surviving Confederate soldiers who were basically trying to survive on their own. And they were outmanned by all the freed black people. That was what led to the formation of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, and the number of Confederate soldiers, by the way, that marched home after the war was over was about 25,000. Think about that, folks. 800,000 people died in this war. The number of Confederate soldiers left was 25,000.
Right, and they were outnumbered overwhelmingly by the freed blacks. So because they were already outnumbered by the blacks. So and
to end this, because I know
we're reeling back in. You guys are way off the rabbit trail.
Is you're right. There was a lot of the racism. If there was heavy racism, it was in the North. They feared that once the blacks were emancipated, they'd go north looking for work, and they didn't want them in their neighborhoods, basically. Right. Now, that's not to say there was no racism in the South. I don't want to be misunderstood.
I agree.
I'm not saying that slave owners that many slave owners were not racist. Racism existed. It was a very racist time period, but the mechanisms of slavery that really got everything going and what it was really about was not about racism. It was about the need for workers. They didn't say, "Oh, black, let's just make them slaves." Yeah. No, it's like, we need this to 100%. Be done. We need it done to be cheaply. There is a pool of people there on that continent. Let's use that pool. And you also got to remember, when it comes to slavery, and slaves are basically a product. There is no product movement if there are only buyers. There has to be sellers. Mm-hmm. Who are the sellers?
So these are important points when we're going through the whole purpose of this, going through the Confederate Constitution, because it gets into the causality and what these gentlemen were thinking at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. It's not a terrible rabbit trail. It's just a longer one than it needs to be, because you guys both hammer the same point home really hard. But it's an important point.
Yeah.
So jumping back into the subject matter, if I may. Yes, I'm giving these guys a hard time. I knew when I got Ron and Doug on at the same time, especially on this topic, that they are going to pontificate because we're passionate about these subjects. It's going to happen.
I mean, you guys know who kind of like my significant other is, and she is just absolutely passionately on the opposite side of my take, and complains all the time. Oh, well, I'm only 3/5 of a person. And it's just so. I mean, I have this is a war that I fight in my life on a daily basis. So, but who knows if I'll ever make any inroads there? But this, the point, and I'll end with this. The point of the matter is that what she believes is what the vast majority of the country also believes, and it's
what they've been taught.
I believe that it's incumbent upon us to spread this knowledge as best we can to try to correct the lies that have perpetuated this racism and prejudice.
All right, moving on. Article 1. Now you're going to find that this Confederate Constitution is laid out almost identical to the U.S. Constitution. These guys, they were cheating. They didn't write it from scratch. They had a really good draft to start with, and they just made the adjustments they thought were necessary. So just as in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, it's about the legislative branch. All legislative powers herein designated shall be vested in a Congress.
Delegated.
What's that?
Delegated. You said designated. They're delegated.
Oh, thank you. I'm getting so old I can't even read. In a Congress of the Confederate States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives.
Now it's interesting. All legislative powers herein delegated. The word in the Constitution is granted. And granted meaning going from the states to this new federal government. These powers are not going from the states to this new government. It's being delegated by this document and by those states. So they actually changed that word appropriately.
They also, there's another big word there is the word vested.
Vested. Mm-hmm.
And that's very important. We're not going to talk about that during this stuff, but when we talk about vested powers are ones you cannot give away, and that just leads us right into
vested is a key word when it comes to separation of powers. And it means exclusionary and irrevocable, and granted.
So, in other words, the Federal Reserve is not legal.
Yeah, that's a different conversation.
Oh, now that's another rabbit hole.
We're not going there. We're not going there. It's my fault.
Yeah. Well, Article 1, Section 8, coining money is vested in Congress, but they gave it away with a piece of legislation. Can't
save it. Save it. We're going to get to Section 8.
Kept it short.
Okay. All right. Section 2. House of Representatives. shall be composed of members chosen every second year, just like the U.S. Constitution, by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall be citizens of the Confederate States. I'll stop there. That's 2 points being made. The first is just like the U.S. Constitution, every 2 years for the House of Representatives. The second part is interesting, and the electors of each state shall be citizens of the Confederate States. A couple topics they're hitting on there. Doug, do you want to address that, the electors, or do you want to do the citizens?
It's going out of its way to make sure that the people electing these people are citizens. You can only be a citizen of this country in order to vote. Now, while that is said in the Constitution and in its various amendments regarding voting, that you have to be a citizen to vote, there was already an issue going on where non-citizens were being snuck in to vote for cheating in elections. And so they wanted to spell it out here. They wanted to make sure it was clear. Once again, it's going back to what we were saying earlier in the preamble when it came to invoking the favor of the guidance of Almighty. They wanted to spell it. They want to make sure it was fully understood. You have to be a citizen to vote for a member of the House, and when you get to the Senate and all that, it's also there. But so that's interesting. And they repeat it again, by the way, in this section.
Yep. And have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature.
Now that is a complete mirror of the Constitution. It's basically saying whatever the state's requirements are for you to vote in the state for its state House representatives, those requirements for you as a voter need to be met also to vote for the House of Representatives.
And here's the big one, because we've been litigating this quite a bit. But no person of foreign birth, not a citizen of the Confederate States, shall be allowed to vote for any officer, civil or political, state or federal.
And state or federal, that's huge. Because the states are saying, okay, fine, you won't let illegal aliens vote federally, but nothing the Constitution says that they can't do that at the state level. And so we are actually seeing that now, where a lot of states are allowing local elections to be voted by illegal immigrants or illegal aliens. And they wanted to make sure that there was no foreign influence, that the North wasn't influencing their elections. So, yeah, the illegal aliens in the Confederate States wasn't from Mexico. They were from the North. But nonetheless.
See, Doug, I make the argument there is no such thing as a federal or national election. All elections are local. President of the United States, you're voting for your members of the Electoral College. That's a statewide issue. Senate, that's in-state. Congress, that's in-state. There are no federal elections. Therefore,
well, it's for federal offices, so that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, and that's wordplay, and I think we're letting them get away with something there by differentiating between.
No, I know what they're trying to do. That's what they do. They hijack language and they play with language. And when I say they, I'm talking about opponents of the Constitution. But when it comes to this right here, once again, this is the Confederate States had the same concerns that the early American states had, because they were worried about foreign influence. It's the reason why natural born citizen and all of these other mechanisms to protect that the people who are going to be involved in the system are have allegiance to the United States, because they were worried about the Tories, for example, when it came to the revolutionaries. The Confederate States had the exact same concerns, but they had not only their own version of Tories, but also they were now neighboring the country who wanted to kill them. And they want to do everything they could to keep that foreign influence out of their system. And so they took the language of the Constitution and they spelled out even more so for that protection, for that you've got to show allegiance. You've got to be a part of this. Otherwise, you're not going to be involved in this. And there was a real fear of infiltration and things like that.
Very good. All right, continuing on to Section 3.
I was just going to say that the reason that they did that is it's basically neuro-linguistic programming. So they say one thing like Patriot Act. Oh, that's not. Yeah. So
Section 2, Clause 2, I think is what you're going to next, right?
Yeah, we'll get just last little thing on the highlighted part about the foreign birth citizenship. This isn't quite totally defining natural born citizenship, but it's sure hinting that that's what they meant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 2. No person shall be a representative shall have not attained the age of 25 years and be a citizen of the Confederate States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state. That's verbatim, word for word, makes perfect sense.
Except that it left out residency, that you need to be a minimum 7 years residency. That was left out.
Only an inhabitant at the time. Okay, that's a good catch, Doug. That's why we have you here. So I don't have to go back and forth between the documents all day. All right, Section 2, Part 3. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. Stop.
Interesting. Their taxation was to be the same as the way it was constitutionally, and which was that the states were paying part of the taxes, part of the federal budget, based on their population. That's where the apportion comes from. What's even more interesting than that is while the Confederate States are trying to stay as true to the Constitution on taxes as possible, it was the Lincoln administration that introduced an individual income tax, which violated the Constitution.
Yeah, and the apportionment's very important. It's for the umpteenth time to understand the balance when you're founding both the United States and the Confederate States. You get your representatives based on the population. If you're a bigger state, you're going to get more people in the House, and more electoral votes. It's a trade-off for that is with more people, you're also going to pay more in taxes.
Right.
So it's really the balance. The smaller and poorer states don't have to get paid, don't have to get charged more, and they also get less representation. And that was a pretty workable balance. It was natural. Among the several states which may be included within this confederacy, according to their respective numbers, talking about apportionment, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, so indentured.
Yeah, voluntary indentured service.
And excluding Indians not taxed, because they are not citizens, and 3/5 of all slaves. There's your
they use the word slaves. The founding fathers would not use the word slaves. And in fact, in the U.S. Constitution, the word slave does not appear until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 3/5 of all slaves. They still saw a need to count slave population as a part of apportionment.
Well, that's because it's a big contributor to your GDP and therefore impacts the taxes.
Right.
I want to make the point that, we are not arguing that slavery had nothing to do with a reason for secession. It did. Right. It was a part of it. And you're going to see it in this document.
It was an ingredient, but it wasn't the primary ingredient.
Yeah. There's probably 4 main ingredients. I would say of those 4, slavery was probably the 4th of the main 4. But that's important that, that you can see that in the language. We're not dismissing that slavery was an issue. It was. Continuing.
Yeah, they knew it was on its way out too, though.
Well, it's interesting, since you're going to bring that up right now. I read an interesting piece just last week about how they actually thought that the court system was going to eventually be what did in slavery. Would have been done via court decisions. And it makes it, I didn't bring the argument with me, but I'll do that next week. It's an interesting argument. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress, and within every subsequent term every 10 years. Census.
That's a 10-year census, right?
Yep. In such manner as they shall by law direct. They're talking about how they count populations. The number of representatives shall not exceed, here it comes, 1 for every 50,000. Now, why is that important? Well, because the original First Amendment had that exact language of the Bill of Rights.
Actually, no. This is different language than what you think it is. It says the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 50,000. In other words, you cannot have more than 1 representative for any population of 50,000 or less. It was 30,000, I believe, in Article 1. It's just saying that it's not saying, though, it has to be 1 per 50. It's just saying that you cannot have more than 1 representative for 50,000 or less. The language you're referring to is the original First Amendment. And in that amendment, it's saying it has to be 1 per. This is just saying that you cannot have more than one representative for that amount of people, but it is not saying that that one person can't represent 100,000 or 200,000 or whatever. This language is, once again, very similar to the Constitution as it was written, except for that rather than 50,000, it was 30,000.
Very good. And the smallest state, the next part says each state shall have at least one representative. The smallest state in terms of population ever granted to the Union was Nevada. It happened during the Civil War, specifically because Nevada had a silver rush going on, and Lincoln wanted the silver to help pay for his war. But every other state has had more population. But each state shall have at least one representative. And until such enumeration shall be made, the state, okay, here it goes. The state of South Carolina shall have 6, Georgia 10, state of Alabama 9, blah, blah, blah. What's interesting about this is Virginia would join about weeks after this was ratified. And it was the largest state by population. So they had to reapportion very quickly.
Another thing that's fascinating here, too, is Georgia, before Virginia joined, had the largest population. But when the 13 original colonies were put into place, Georgia was in the lower half. It was one of the less populated states.
What's also interesting is the state of Florida was the smallest at the time, and now it's the second biggest of the southern states.
Well, it only recently joined the Union. It had been a territory for over 20 years, but it only recently had joined the Union. I mean, like right before secession.
Was that when, like 1856 or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. It was like right before secession.
Continuing on. When vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies.
The writs of election being a special election.
Mm-hmm.
Executive authority being the governor.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting is they're dictating that in the U.S. Constitution.
Exact same language.
Yeah. Isn't that left up to the states when there's a vacancy in the House?
Yes. Once again, the governor would issue writs of election, special election to replace that person.
Right.
Yeah, and I know there's some games.
So they're not going to wait the 2 years or whatever. They're going to do it a special election, and that person serves out the remainder of whatever the term was.
They're playing games right now in New York, trying to leave at least Stefanik's seat open for like another 9 months. I don't think that's going to pass, but it's interesting. All right, Clause 5. The House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment. That's identical. Except that any judicial or other federal officer resident and acting solely within the limits of any state may be impeached by a vote of 2/3 of both branches of the legislature thereof.
And that's a change.
Yes. Let's go through that. What are they saying? If a federal officer is working inside of a state, that legislature can impeach him. Said, we do not want this tax collector here. He is not, following what we'd like to see. Any thoughts?
I'm rereading it to make sure I've got it, but go ahead if you have anything.
No, I just think it's a really good idea. Let's say you're in, this goes back to the founding days. The British would have their governors and other officials in the colonies, and the colonies that couldn't do anything about it, couldn't get rid of the authority. And this traces back to that kind of same residual.
So it's saying the House of Representatives has the sole power of impeachment unless that impeachment is of a judicial or federal officer or resident acting solely within the limits of any state. Then it takes both bodies, legislative bodies of
that state. They're talking about the state. So a state can impeach a federal officer if that officer is only working within the limits of that state.
But the impeachment isn't by one house. It takes both houses. It takes 2/3. In other words, it better be pretty egregious.
Yeah, but
of course, now the impeachment conviction, I'm going to assume, would still belong to the U.S. Senate.
Well, the idea of the impeachment is to remove it. Let's say you get a bad federal judge.
Right, but impeachment is not the removal. That's just the indictment.
Yeah. All right, moving on.
But it's saying that a state can indict a federal officer, but it requires 2/3 of both of their legislative houses.
Yes, and it's just removal.
You know, it's funny because I've read that before, and I didn't pick up on that before.
And so a state, like, well, let's just say use examples. So Alabama can impeach a representative at the federal level in the Confederacy. If they're like they can impeach a senator that's representing Alabama in the Confederate Senate.
That's not what it's saying.
You got to remember, it's understood in the U.S. Constitution that the federal government cannot encroach on a state without a state's permission.
No, I'm okay. I get that. I'm trying to clarify.
But there is no mechanism for the state in the Constitution to take care of that if a federal officer refuses to abide by that and encroaches anyway or acts in a manner in which a state doesn't want. This is giving the state the ability to take care of that.
Yep. So they're talking about right here and highlighted a judicial or other federal officer. They're not talking about an elected official. You can't remove someone else.
Okay. All right.
And it's only if that person is resident and acting solely within the limits of any state. So if you've got a federal judge, in Alabama, and he's, giving terrible rulings, Alabama's legislature can get rid of him. That's it.
Gotcha.
Okay, there we go.
So it didn't apply. When you say
it is interesting. Yeah, it's a good mechanism. I like it.
Yeah, I agree.
It is. I think it's an improvement on the Constitution.
Well, it could be, unless you that would be a horrible thing to do in California. If you've got like pro 2A,
everything's horrible in California.
If you've got a pro 2A judge and the state government didn't like all the renderings or the judgments that were coming out of his bench, and because they violated what they believed in terms of from a tyrannical standpoint.
Right.
But that's the state's problem.
Acting solely within the limits.
That happens within the state.
Acting solely within the limits of any state. So you're talking about the Ninth Circuit. That's not just California. So this would not apply. Not the circuit.
Well, if he was operating at the Ninth Circuit in San Diego, and I'll be specific and talk about Benitez. Benitez has been the primary judge.
He's a district judge, not a circuit judge.
But he's still a federal judge.
Yeah, but it's district. District would operate solely within the state. Circuit judge would not.
Okay, I get your point. All right.
Remove a district, you couldn't remove a circuit.
Okay. All right.
That's good.
I'm glad. I'm just trying to clarify, because if I have,
good, because I'm sure other people are asking the same question.
Right. That's exactly why we're here, is to have these conversations. So good questions. Moving on. Okay, where we're at, we're just past the hour mark. Let's get through a few more sections here, since it's going pretty good. The Senate of the Confederate States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. Where'd they get that from? Chosen for 6 years by the legislature thereof. What a good idea.
Well, this was pre-17th Amendment. Even the United States hadn't screwed it up yet. At the regular session next, immediately preceding the commencement of the term of service, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Basically identical to how the U.S. Senate was set up originally. Probably nothing to add there. Immediately after they shall be assembled, in consequence of the first election, they shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of the senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the 2nd year, second class at the expiration of the 4th year, and the 3rd class at the expiration of the 6th year. Every 2 years, you get a third of the Senate reelected, just like in the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, this was to make sure that there was a third of the Senate was up for a reelection every 2 years. Yep. Which is basically what it says in the next sentence.
But is the legislature the legislative body for the people gets to vote for 1 senator, and the legislative body for the state or the counties gets to vote for
No, it's chosen by they were chosen by the legislature. You're thinking electors.
I thought in the U.S. Constitution, I thought that the senators were voted on. Like one senator was voted on by, and so I'll use California as the example. One senator was voted on by the Assembly, and the other one was voted on by the state Senate.
Oh, that's correct, and that's what they're doing here. I thought you said by the people, meaning democratically.
Right. No,
it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, Ron. It's just the legislature can determine how they do it. And I think if we repeal the 17th Amendment, you'd find, all kinds of bickering, and there'd be some kind of compromise. But
right.
If vacancies happen by resignation or otherwise during the recess of the legislature of any state, the executive thereof may make temporary appointments until the next meeting of the legislature, which shall then fill such vacancies.
That's the same language of the Constitution.
Yeah. No
It's
special.
basically saying that if a senatorial position is vacated because it's up to the legislature to pick senators, but what if they're out of session? Then the governor can make it a temporary appointment.
Yep. So not a whole lot of changes from the original Constitution so far. But the ones we have seen, they've been subtle but important. No person shall be a senator who's not been 30 years old. That's the same as citizen of the Confederate States, and
it's all the same except for at least out 9 years a resident.
Exactly. Be an inhabitant of the state. The vice president of the Confederate States shall be the president of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided.
Same.
The Senate shall choose their other officers, and also a president pro tempore in the absence of the VP, or when he shall exercise the office of the president of the Confederate States.
Same except for the word Confederate.
We don't have to point that out every time, I think.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
I think it's right.
I was being funny. Sorry.
I know.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, I think this is the Confederate Constitution.
Yes. Good. God. We have Captain Obvious here today, people.
Hey, that's how I roll, baby.
The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, they shall be on oath or affirmation.
Now, no, it says shall have sole power to try all impeachments. So if an impeachment was put in play by the state legislature, as we were talking about earlier, it would still have to go to the Senate, the Confederate Senate, in order to reach conviction.
Got it. Clarification on the earlier part.
Mm-hmm.
They shall be on oath or affirmation. When the president of the Confederate States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside.
Yeah, because if the vice president, who's president of the Senate, presided, there'd be a conflict.
Very good. And no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present.
And the highlighted is pretty much the same as the Constitution.
Very good. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold any office of honor, trust, or profit under the Confederate States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law.
Now, that's the same language as the United States Constitution. Just for clarification, what it's saying is that if a person is impeached and then convicted of that impeachment, then they are also subject to criminal court. Now, when it comes to the president, since the president has certain immunities, what that means is the president, unless convicted of something through impeachment, will not face criminal court after his presidency. This is what they did to our current president is actually a violation of that. You can't go after a president criminally for what he did in office unless he was impeached for it and convicted of it.
And the Supreme Court agreed with you. For the most part, they didn't. The opinion didn't
Not
state
exactly the same, but
they didn't state it quite as clearly and concisely as you just did. But that's kind of what they meant. They left a little bit of ambiguity because there are some hypothetical cases that aren't quite addressed, but we digress. Section 4, important language. The time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed by each state by the legislature thereof, subject to the provision of the Constitution. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the time and places of choosing senators. Now, the biggest difference between this and the original Constitution is in those 80 years they learned how to spell the word choosing. Come on, Doug, you know that's hilarious.
I don't think he's paying attention.
Well, because there's language also there that's not in the Constitution. I was just checking to make sure I was right in my mind. Subject to the provisions of this Constitution. That language is not in the original Constitution. They decided to add it for clarification. But otherwise the language is exactly the same. And yeah, you're funny. And now they know how to spell choose.
The reason that's a joke, people, is if you read the original Constitution, they spelled choosing CHUSING. And we joked that, no, that was not a typo. They were not.
Yeah, well, they learned how to spell defense also.
Yeah, there's a few. I think there's 3 of those the changes on the actual spelling. That's an important clause.
Well, hey, they changed how to spell your. It's no longer YOURE or YOUR. It's just UR.
Well, now that's got me thinking. Go ahead, because I got to look at something now.
That was a joke. I'm just
no.
I
just got to
for the
thinking.
brevity of texting. People don't know how to write these days because
I was just wondering if insure in the preamble was changed, but no, it's the same INSURE. So never mind.
Okay. Spelling 101. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year. Darn it. And such a meeting shall be on the first Monday in December unless they shall, by law, appoint a different day. This goes back to
wow. So they can't. It's kind of like Texas, where they have a part-time legislature. They can only come.
Well, and as I tell it when I teach my classes, and the original Constitution says Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and I tell people it's one of my favorite lines of the Constitution, because there were actually those who argued that was too often.
Yeah. Each house, Section 5. How are we doing on time? Yeah, we got time to delve into Section 5 a little bit. Each house shall be judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business.
Same.
Well, it's interesting. I was watching about 5-10 minutes of you guys' show on Ron's channel last night of the regular Constitution, and you were talking about quorum, and Doug stated a quorum is at least 50%. Actually,
I did not say that. It said it's more than 50%.
Yeah, okay. But even that's not true. For example, different organizations can set their own.
Now, I explained that in my classes. I was saying for this purpose.
Got it.
Quorum is the number required to do business. I had a friend of mine who was a member of a company, and all they needed was 10% to have a quorum, which is ridiculously stupid. But, quorum means the number needed to do business.
It's important. We have an HOA with 4 households. And the actual bylaws, some idiot wrote in that a quorum required all 4 people. I go, what's the point of having a quorum if you need all 4? Say unanimous, but it's a sticky point.
Now, but anyway, for the purposes of the Constitution and the Confederate Constitution, a quorum is 50% plus 1.
Yes. And that matters sometimes. It did back then because it was a little harder to assemble everybody all at once because they did not have airlines.
No, they didn't, and there was no paved roads. It was all either horse and buggy or whatever. But it was travel at that time was very difficult.
Well, I can't wait until we get Scotty and our teleporter.
Amen.
But a smaller number may adjourn from day to day and may be
that is a pro forma session.
Thank you.
Look it up.
And do we have that in the U.S. Constitution?
Yes.
And may be authorized to compel the attendance of absent members. Is that there?
Mm-hmm.
In such a manner and under such penalties as each house may provide.
Yeah, Section 5, Clause 1 is literally worded exactly as it is in the Constitution.
Most of Section 5.
May I ask a question here? Considering the travel restrictions of everybody at that moment, and in that time period, I think it's a rather, Washington D.C. or Philadelphia were kind of central in the colonies, from all the way from the north to the south. Why would they have chosen Richmond, Virginia?
Because it was closer to the war. Originally, it was Montgomery, Alabama, which is more centralized.
Okay, that's I didn't know that.
Yeah, remember, Virginia was not one of the original Confederate states. They did not join until after Fort Sumter.
Right.
So the capital.
So the original Confederate capital was going to be Montgomery, Alabama.
Well, it was in Montgomery. They moved it as the war proceeded. They needed the powers to dictate and for military movement closer to the military front. And Virginia was it.
Here's a little trivia for you. Where did the capital move after Richmond was taken over?
Trying to remember.
Where did Lee surrender?
Appomattox, but it wasn't in Appomattox.
Not there.
Yeah, Appomattox was.
Well, that's a good question, Mom. What's the answer?
Danville, Virginia.
Okay.
Only reason I know that is because when I lived in South Boston, that was Danville was like a 30-minute drive, and that's what they were known for, was the second Confederate capital. But
third.
but miraculously it'd be the third.
Very good. Each house.
I cheated. Sorry.
That's allowed. Each house may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3 of the whole number, expel a member.
Exact same language.
Yeah, so this whole section, I think, is going to be verbatim.
Yeah.
Each house shall keep it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings, and from time to time publish the same, excepting such parts as may, in their judgment, require secrecy.
Transparency.
Uh-huh. Except they get to judge what they want to keep secret.
Well, who else would judge it?
Nobody, people.
Well, but if you're not supposed to know it because it's secret, how are you going to know It has to be them.
How about that?
I understand. I understand the danger, but nonetheless, it has to be them.
Why have secrets at all?
Because we have.
Well, you don't want everybody to know how to make a nuclear bomb.
Well, that's not a congressional issue now, is it?
Actually, it is.
Yeah, I would say it is.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuclear physicists in Congress these days.
Touche.
And the yeas and nays of the members of either house on any question at the desire of 1/5 of those present be entered on the journal. And that's just calling for a roll call vote, right?
Well, and that's also saying that if there is something that, if there is a time when the votes need to be kept secret, it takes 4/5 of them to say that needs to remain secret. Only a fifth needs to say, "Hey, yeas and nays need to be public info."
Excellent. Neither house during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any other place than that in which the two houses shall be sitting.
Again, verbatim.
Very good. That's probably a good place to stop.
Yeah, I was going to say we're right about your 75-minute mark right now.
Yeah.
Really? See, it doesn't feel like that much time has passed. But then again, folks, so much fun with Warhamster and Ron, right?
Yeah, exactly. We just
time flies.
I'm worn out from my.
I noticed that the rabbit population decreased as we got moving.
All right. I wanted to ask you both, and this kind of about the state secrets thing. I think it was like 1946 or 47 when there was a B-29 they were testing some sort of like navigation equipment or whatever on this B-29, and from what I understand, the pilots were kind of hot dogging it, and there were civilians. There was three civilians on board that were the contractors working on the equipment, and although the plane ultimately crashed, killing everybody on board, and the Air Force didn't want to reveal because of the sensitive nature of the equipment that they were testing. They didn't want to reveal any information about the crash to the family members of the civilian contractors. Ultimately, what that led to was the State Secret Act, which is what is used now across the board in terms of
they overclassify everything today.
Right.
But that's what happens. Whenever anything is in place, you're always going to have actors that are going to game the system. That's just reality of human nature.
Right. So, that State Secret Act to me is a horrible thing, and of course that happened right at the time of just post World War II when things were really starting to go off.
Well, and it really wasn't necessary because it says right there in the Constitution that Congress can choose what is going to be secretive and what is not.
Well, it really what it came down to is, like I said, the Air Force just didn't want to admit that their pilots were being reckless, and but that all being said, that was the court case that has been used essentially ever since to keep almost everything secret at the military level.
Well, I think we're actually looking at two different subjects. There's what Congress wants to keep secret from the people, and what the I guess the executive branch, in this case the military, wants to keep secret from everyone, including Congress. And those are two different topics. And
you're that valid point, but it kind of brought that up. It made me think about what you were talking about there, because in terms of who wants to keep secrets from who and what, why.
We can dive into that more later. Let's give closing thoughts on what we went over today and wrap up.
Okay.
Ron?
Well, the similarities between the U.S. Constitution and the Confederate Constitution are striking, but as we've pointed out a few times, a lot of the additional language was basically to make sure certain things were clarified better.
Right.
They also sought to make sure it was understood that the states had autonomy, and I think that was necessary for what they were trying to do.
Ron, you want to add anything?
I was everything I was going to say. Doug just basically said. So I just echo what he said. It's amazing, how a word can change. You change one word and it completely transforms the entire passage. Meaning something significantly different. What was it? The first one up in Article 1, Section 1, when it talked about herein delegated shall be vested. It's what was what was the original one? It wasn't delegated. It was granted, right? So it's similar but different, right. And it's so yeah. I mean, just that as a specific example of how these men knew the problems that they were dealing with, primarily because they were the ones that were on the brunt end of how the Constitution had been bastardized. So
not entirely. The Buchanan presidency, which is just get out of, that was a Southern Democrat presidency, and they were about as corrupt as any administration we've ever seen. So it went both ways. But your point's valid.
Right.
They had 80 years of firsthand experience of the Constitution, where the Constitution needed tweaking.
And they had seen how the Constitution it was, as long as the men who were in office were virtuous, it got upheld. And then once you got past, say, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, then you started seeing the deterioration really fast. About the only president between Jackson and Buchanan that was worth a dang was probably William
Tyler.
Benjamin Harrison, which didn't get a chance to do anything, and John Tyler.
Tyler's our guy. If you guys don't know, Doug and I did a show, got him about 6-9 months ago. Basically said, is John Tyler the most constitutional president in history? And he might have been. There's an argument to be made.
You know, it's funny. You guys will appreciate this, but whenever you're driving on the 91 freeway and one of the main roads that you exit is Tyler, and it's
and the Tyler Mall is right there, right?
Tyler Mall, exactly. So it's like
and it is named after that
right,
president.
Right, exactly. So it's kind of funny because now every time I drive by that, or which isn't that often, but anytime I do, it's like that's what I think of now. So
let's see, was he president when California joined the Union? Is that why he got all that props there?
No, they named a bunch of streets after.
All
so
the
you've got Adams and Van Buren, which is a major thoroughfare, and Tyler and so on and so forth. Adams,
Washington, Jackson, all the Pierce, Buchanan. I mean, there's a whole slew of streets that are.
I'm up here in colonial New England, and like for example, when I go to the store later today, I'm going to be on Lafayette Road most of the time. But a lot of these streets are named after all kinds of founders.
Understandably so. Lafayette was Lafayette. The name Lafayette is all over the United States just because of what they did for the American Revolution.
And he was such a youngster when he came to the United States, but he was probably among the best generals.
Yeah.
All right, let's give it a wrap. This is pretty good. We've, like I said, we've pointed out the similarities of the U.S. Constitution. The one thing I was going to say is, we three of us have been talking about the Constitution for 3-4 years all the time. And the one thing I, kept coming back at when I first met Doug is, God, I wish they'd clarified a few of these things in the original Constitution just a little bit, and because they were pretty clear. It's just the language has changed, and what these guys writing the Confederate Constitution are also recognizing the language is slightly changed, but you wouldn't.
They had seen and how it was being gamed and how people were taking advantage of the General Welfare Clause, stuff like that. So then they wanted to make sure they fixed that.
Yeah, and to your point there, I think that in the year 2025, we fall victim to applying the language that's in the Constitution to our understanding of the words of today, as opposed to how they were written when they were written. So, just like in biblical hermeneutics, when you talk about audience relevance, you have to take into consideration who the audience was that the words were being written to, so that you can gain a proper understanding of what they were trying to say. And that's one way that the people who are trying to manipulate things in their favor twist and contort, and they use words that have maybe different meanings. It's like something that's bad.
That's exactly my point, Ron. Is that you look at Supreme Court justices, you have these textualists who read the words carefully and interpret it how they want, and then you've got the originalists, with the ones I favor, who actually look at what they meant when they wrote it.
Right, the text of the times and the audience, absolutely.
When I talk about clarifying the original Constitution, I'd like to write it in very simple language. This is the enumeration doctrine. If it's not in here, you can't do it. That kind of stuff. So there can never
wait a second. I thought it was living and breathing and twisting and bending and molding and
it is. It's called the amendment practice. It's called the amendment process. It's slow and methodical.
If we were ever to do another constitution or God forbid something like this, the one thing that I would propose is that to understand the language in this document, use this particular dictionary of this time to understand what we meant. And then therefore, in the future, 200 years from now, if these words mean something different, you'll know what we were trying to accomplish by using this particular document. That would be that would be something that I would, like to say.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and draft that for us and have it ready next week to present it?
Hey, I will.
All right.
I'll work on that. I'll stop everything I'm doing and do it today.
Gentlemen, thanks for coming on. We'll see you next week. When you see me next Wednesday, I will be a legally married man.
Oh my God!
Oh,
yeah, this Saturday.
George. So when is the funeral?
No time soon. George Washington's birthday will be my anniversary. So
That's
very
interesting.
nice.
So does that mean you can never tell a lie then, right?
I never could anyway. Just like Honest Abe, Doug.
No.
Yeah.
All right, I'm out of here on that. I am out of here on that note.
Talk about neuro-linguistic programming.
So check out Ron at untoldhistory.tv, me at douglasvgibbs.com. I got a new video out, by the way. I finally got it to render last night. And so I take a look at federal spending transparency. So
Excellent.
Awesome.
I mean, I'll have
Good to
check
see you,
that out.
gentlemen. Enjoy your day, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys next week if we don't talk before.
Cheers, everyone.